Now we are ready to add on to weld on, forge weld on our reins. And we want to get to here. Here's the jaw assembly, and that's what we just made. And then this is what we're gonna make, and this is a scarf. So I just want to go over some terminology. The scarf has 3-point parts. It has a toe, it has a heel, and then it has a neck, which I don't know why it's not called an ankle, but you know, everything I read about it, they call this the neck on the heel and the toe. And you kind of get the heel and the toe. If you turn that up, it does look like a little shoe. But I will talk through why and how you make this scarf. So since we are using our hammer to make this, it's very important that we know how the hammer impacts the metal as it penetrates its piece. And there are 4 factors for that. Those of you who attended the basket handle talk, this is going to look familiar to you, but it always is good to review. The first is that the type of metal that you're using. Mild steel is more malleable than tool steel, which has a higher carbon content and makes it less squishy, a little harder to move. We're using mild steel. We're also forge welding, so how hot the metal is dictated. It has to be very, very hot. And it's very important that your forge is hot enough to get your material to be yellow hot. I'm gonna show you a little video of just that happening. So here we have a fire in full force, and you notice these bright yellow coals down here. That's the color you want. And there is some material in here. When your material gets lost in those coals, you've reached the right temperature. But this is the look you want. Bright yellow with this liquid effect. That's actually flux running around on there. But see how wet and shiny that looks? As it cools, and this is just taking a second or two, as it cools, you start getting this crusty, dry look. That crusty, dry stuff is oxidation or scale. It's dirty and it won't weld. Anything that looks like this won't weld. The other side of this is still a little runny, so we get to still welding temperature, so we get to watch that transition into from wet to the dry, crusty part. That's how long you have to get your pieces positioned together in the correct alignment to forge weld them. Everything we do is to maneuver the pieces within the time window of having that yellow hot heat. So the third factor that impacts the hammer penetration is the strength of your blow. And when you are forge welding, you do not want to hit this super hard. All that's going to do is distort the pretty little scarf you just made on the edge of your metal. What you want is a light to moderate blow so that the weld can take place at that atomic level. It is not the strength of your blow that gets the metal to weld. It is having it at the right temperature and tapping it to convince it that it likes its new neighbor. And then the fourth factor is the location of the blow. And as I discuss the location of the blow, you'll see why the scarf is important. If you wanted to put these 2 pieces together at this welding plane right here, you'd have to hit from the sides. If you wanted to put these together and this becomes your welding plane, you'd want to hit from here or here. That means your welding plane should be perpendicular-ish. Doesn't have to be perfectly perpendicular. See that fast three times in a row. it has to be perpendicular-ish to your hammer blows. Then the welding plane is this perpendicular line in the middle. Having metal positioned here, hitting from here or straight on top, you've entered the shearing plane, and that will not weld. That'll just kind of bust your pieces apart. So as you're hitting here, the metal is going to be pushed down into this bottom piece. And since we have our nice welding plane, this straight edge becomes a problem. In fact, it'll act like a chisel and push down in here to create a crack. This will all weld, but you'll have these cracks here because this is in a shearing plane. It's not perpendicular to your hammer blows, so the shearing plane shears your metal. So get ahead of it, outsmart it. Put a nice taper on the edge. Now it's more in this welding plane, and as you hit this and this stretches out, it'll blend nicely into the piece on the bottom. And I have proof that that's exactly what happens. This is magnified. This is a 1/2 inch tall, cut long ways, and you can see the weld started from here, went to here, and you can even see where it got a little crumbly there, where it might have got a little too hot. This was a fluxless weld, so this had to be heated to a little higher temperature and cause those little cracks. But this line is not drawn in there. That is exactly how this metal looks. And what that's telling us is where those two pieces came together was, it had the carbon burned out of it. It's the iron at this point and not steel, or at least if it has any carbon, it's a lot less carbon than in here, which gives you this darker hue than the nice welded line right through the middle, which has less carbon. So as you're hitting this, you've got your initial taper in there. The top piece is going to move a lot more than the bottom piece. Another way to think about it is this bottom piece just became an extension of the anvil. And if we do a little thought experiment, I'll try to make that point even clearer. If we had a really hot bar just suspended by some super strong string that could handle all that heat, and you hit it with all of your might at the end, the only part of that metal that'll be impacted is the end. It'll be deformed by your hammer blow. The rest of this won't have moved at all. And so this acted like an anvil at this point, a solid piece of metal that allows you to manipulate the other end of this metal. So bring this toe in and create a 3-sided taper. Now you've got a nice welding plane on the front, and you have room to grow from side to side as you hit the top of your top bar. Now we get to the step, or why do we put a little heel in our scarf? The reason is it has to do with how long you want your weld. If you had a big long weld, some of you may think, oh, well, that'll make it even stronger. Well, I'll counter that you're actually just setting yourself up for more issues. We are in a race against time. We want the metal in position and ready to go while it still has that super hot, high temperature. If you have a long heat, you're going to have trouble getting a nice long heat on there, and you run the risk of losing the heat as you get things together. These tips in particular are going to cool faster, and you could end up with some oxidation under here. So give yourself a break, make it a very short weld, and that will give you more flexibility in terms of how far back the heat is, and not run the risk of getting oxidation under here. This step, by setting a step in there, will become kind of an indices or a marker as to where you want these to match up. The other part then that we want to talk about is how this reacts to the high heat and a potential errant hammer blow. You are going to hit here straight up and down, follow this angle down with your hammer, which makes this very vulnerable to an errant hammer blow. You're also going to have this super hot, so you're going to lose some of the material to oxidation. So having this just a little thicker at the outset will give you room to maneuver within this piece, or within your forge welding. So in short, the scarf right here has this thicker neck, a little step, and a three-sided taper at the end. So as we get ready to do that, it's important, once again, to consider the fact that we only have one flat side. We have a shoulder here, we have a shoulder here, we have a shoulder on the other side. So when we weld this, you want this to sit nicely, comfortably, without a lot of trouble on the anvil. You want it flat on the anvil to weld it. That means your little toe has to be pointing away from the flat side of your jaw assembly. So the flat side becomes the shortest side, and that toe will tip away. We're going to call that side A. So you're ready now to cut off your jaw assembly. So let's back up a second and look at how a chisel acts when you cut through the metal. So this would be all hot and you're chiseling down in, it draws this metal down in here, and look at this lovely little angle it's created. That's pretty much the angle we want on our scarf. So what if we accented that a little bit and held our chisel at an angle? We're going to get a twofer out of this. You'll have that angle right here that you want to start your scarf. And remember, this is side A, the flat side, with the toe going away from that. And your parent bar is left with a nice square edge, and you could use it to get your next set of tongs started. So we'll cut through, starting so that you have a good 1/4 inch of the parent stock on this 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch square bar. So here we are, side A. This is the flat side, the shoulders down to protect it, and you're going to cut from the flat side, angling your chisel away from you. The smith is standing over here, and push down in there as you angle that away, and you'll end up with the parent stock having this nice square edge and your taper all ready to go. So let's watch that chisel happening from a different angle. It's just the same steps, but the top of that chisel is being pushed away from the smith, and never chisel all the way down to the end on the anvil. One, the chisel and the anvil don't like meeting up together, but two, this can become a projectile. Like if you hammer that all the way through, that piece could go flying. I've seen them fly a couple 100 yards. So always be careful of that. Now we want to forge down our scarf, and you're going to hit on side A, which is our flat side, and side B. Don't hit these other side for two reasons. One is we want to keep this angle here. If you hit from the other side, this will end up getting stretched more than this, ending up with a big long taper. We don't want that. Remember, we want to keep our forge weld area as short as possible. So hit only on side A, protecting the shoulder by having it over the edge of your anvil, and then hit side B. You can see if you tried to turn it the other way, which you could do, but you run the risk, you don't have a lot of room here, you run the risk of hurting the shoulder. So hitting from side B and side A are going to be very important to protect this angle and to protect these shoulders, or the fancy bits that you so carefully made. If all that goes haywire, that's okay. You can still chisel off that end. And in this case, you can just leave the chisel vertical, because this little bit of nubbin is going to offer no resistance, and it'll just slide on down, giving you that nice, happy little taper that you want. But again, this is your flat side, your side A. Bring in the toes, set in your step by hitting it on top, and then angling down on the welding plane, or this taper here. You could do this on the side of the anvil, that's perfectly fine, or you could do it on a block, which will protect this little bit of your hammer from gouging out your anvil. So let's watch that happen. So tapering down the toe, making that three-sided taper, and then setting your step, and then following that angle down with your hammer at an angle, so you end up with the scarf all ready to go. There's your scarf, and notice how thick that neck is. And then here we're just setting the step on this block, angling down on the hammer to protect your anvil. Now we just get to move into prepping the reins. You're going to use a 1/2 inch round stock, upset each end, and scarf one end. So you would start with about 16 to 20 inches in length. Make a mark in the middle, because you are going to forge weld on your jaw assembly to both sides, and then cutting it in half in the middle. So putting a mark in there now before you've done any forging will help you find the true center. To upset your 1/2 inch round, you want a very short heat. Here, get this nice and fat by hitting from the top, and it'll grow out on the side. Once you have one side, quench it, upset the other side, and then use that heat that you're going to have to get that initial angle started. When you're finished with your upset, you bring the top edge towards your hammer hand, you're going to set an angle on there, which will get you a head start on that three-sided taper. Your other option is to do upsetting blows from the side of the anvil, and that is indeed what you'll have to do with the other side of the reins. And this can happen this way on the side of the anvil, or you could even put it in a post vise and get the angle that way. Correct for any growth in width, since this might be centered on the bar, flatten one side so that as you start to set in your toes, that you're on a nice straight edge. Set your step on the side of the anvil or on a swedge block in the hardy hole, and correct any growth in width, and you should be ready to go. So let's watch the upsetting take place. So notice the lifting up off the anvil, that preserves your heat. setting that angle in place and correcting for any growth in width and getting those toes started. Put in your step. Let's watch that again from another angle. Notice the really short heat. This angle is brought towards the hammer. Correct for growth and width. And then you would just taper in your toes and set in your step. When you're all done, your jaw assembly will have the scarf with the toes pointing up, and your reins will have the toes pointing down as you forge weld them. And this little fit up here, how well these fit together, is probably loosely the only secret to forge welding, even though there's probably no secret to forge welding other than you just have to practice. This fit up is important because we're in a race against time. You have a nice hot heat, you got to position these together, and you have to be hitting that before you lose your heat. If you have to hit it a couple times before these want to talk to each other, because remember that weld is taking place at that atomic level, you've wasted time. So the good fit up is important so that your first hit has these talking to each other and joining together. So here's another break for questions, but this is kind of a fun magnified view of quite a bit to look at that weld we looked at earlier. And notice this white swath through the middle. That's the decarburized area, or the area with less carbon, to make that nice white, almost chalk mark looking effect that we had. I'm not seeing Miguel, so I'm going to guess that.
I'm sorry, I have a quick question. So,
no, I was too soon.
Too soon. Yeah, you're trying to get away from me. So the point of the welded rein is not just to make you suffer through having to weld, I assume.
No.
So why are you welding the reins on? Is it just simply to save your shoulder and arms some work, or what's the thought?
Yeah, you have 3/4 inch square that you're starting with. Why waste that by drawing it down to a 1/4 inch? Save that for more jaw assemblies or for other projects. That's big, hefty stock. So it's a little bit of a waste to draw it out that thin. The other point is drawing that out is a lot of work. And I only have so many hammer hits in me a day. So doing the little maneuvers that it takes to put that scarf on saves you some hammering time. And yeah, thirdly, anytime you have a chance to practice forge welding, I'm going to encourage it. So there is that factor. So now we're ready to execute the drop tong weld. And it's these steps, and I'm going to run all the way through them. Also noticing the time. So I'm going to want to move through this a little quicker so we can get to all the rest of the slides that I have for you. Because I'm about, I guess, 3/4 of the way. So maybe I'm right on time. The first thing I'm going to recommend as you start to forge weld is a dry run. You want your pieces in the right place. You want to make sure they act well together. So try this cold first, and it'll look something like this. And this is a up close and personal photo of what I am recommending happen. The first is, this is your jaw assembly, and it goes on the bottom. That's why I'm stressing it has to be flat on the bottom. And both pieces are going to rest on the edge of the anvil first. So the jaw assembly is being held by your hammer hand with tongs. Set that down first, get that flat on the anvil in a position that you like. And then the other piece, which is on a long bar in your non-hammer hand, rest that on the side of the anvil and maneuver it into position. Once you have it in position, you can pick it up so that you're holding this with pressure on the top of this bar so that everything's being held together. But the more of this you can get on the anvil, the easier that's going to be. And then and only then do you bring this up off the side, hold that all into position, hit the top, follow that down to make that happen. So what does that look like if you can see a little more of the big picture here? That looks like this. You've got the smiths on one side of the anvil, and with their hammer hand reaching around with the tongs, setting that piece down first, and then bringing this piece down, held, anchored on the side of the anvil till it's in the right position, picking that up, thumb adding pressure to keep this in place, tongs get dropped, pick up the hammer, and hit this on top. I also want to point out these little chalk marks on the top of the tongs and the top of this piece. If you give yourself that little leg up, you'll know that they're in the right position when you pull them out of the forge. Hitting it once, following that down, turn it upside down if you still have a good heat, and same thing happens on the other side. So this is the jaw assembly now on top. Hit it on top, track that down. Notice this is not deformed at all. You're not forging, you're forge welding. So now that you have that practiced cold, let's talk about heating it to a welding temperature. This is our first virtual mark.
I put both pieces into the fire with the toes of the scarf up. And at this stage I'm taking them to a welding heat, or just below a welding heat, so that I can flux them. When they get up to there, I'm going to cut the blast. I'm going to pull one out, brush it, flux it, put it back in, pull the other out, brush it, flux it, put it back in. They're both in the same place, hopefully at about the same sort of heat now, and now I've got the heat going again. At this stage I'm allowing them to heat up slowly. I'm not going to rush this. I want the heat to fully penetrate, but I am aware the clock is ticking for the flux in the hot air of the forge environment, so I can't dawdle. As I take a heat and I see them start to get that translucent yellow or sort of high orange, or they're disappearing in the coals of the fire, I'm going to take them and turn them over 2, 3, 4, 5, turn them back, and I'm trying to heat this area here, the heel of the welds. I'll bring them back up, I'll have another little look. Bear in mind this is all going to be covered now. I'm looking at the coals. I can't see these pieces usually. So I'm looking at the coals. Are they bright yellow, indicating a welding temperature? Do they need to get a little hotter? If I'm worried about it, I can just sneak a look, pull it out, have a look at it, put it back. And if I feel like it needs topping up, I'll take a little more heat. Again, I'll go over 2, 3, 4, 5, turn it back, and then I'm going to go and weld. So I'm going to make sure the chalk marks are aligned. That's my welding position. And then I'm going to come out.
While they're in the fire, you can test the tips together, see if they're sticking. If your tips are getting too hot too fast, push it farther in the fire. Get this part nice and hot, because you do want your heat to come back a little bit, because that buys you time. So when you're ready to take them out, chalk marks are up, and then we're ready to go. So here is the next video, is a little more a virtual mark, and the audio actually does cut out. So if it does go away, I'm not going to try and talk over it, because I turned the volume way up and I might blast your ears out. But we're going to watch the two pieces in the fire, and then there'll be a still picture, and we'll watch the weld take place. So just taking out a clinker.
Both pieces have been in the fire for about 30 seconds or so. Let's see if they're in the same spot. I'm going to bring them out and let's have a look at the heat. They seem to be be somewhat equal. This one may be slightly higher. So I'm just going to move both of them slightly to my left. Both pieces looking good. Again, the reins just look a little hotter. So I'm going to brush them quickly. Flux. Flux. Stick it back in about the same half of the fire. Look out. Brush it. That's it. Back in the same part of the fire.
So this is supposed to be quiet.
Over, 2, 3, 4, 5, turn them back, pick up my blower. Two, 3, 4, 5, checking to see if it's sticky. Feels good. Here we go.
A nice slow-mo view of forge welding. Notice how the pieces were rested on the sides till you had this in exactly the right spot. Hit once on top, follow that down to blend in that toe. Turn it over, same thing, hit it on top, blend in the toe, and you're forge welding at this point, not forging. So the pieces are hardly deformed. As long as it holds that nice high yellow heat, you can continue to work on the weld. At this point, dry and crusty, reheat it and start over. But we're gonna watch this again in real time. Blending in the toe, a lot of time to take, you need to spend a lot of time blending in that toe. And once you lost that color, so so that, I'm going to turn Mark down there. So that is tacked in place, and you want to reheat that to a welding temperature before you hit it again. At this point, since the weld is only tacked, it is at risk of failing if you don't keep it at the welding temperature as you continue to work on it. So I'm going to show you again the left-sided world. And notice the smith is on the other side. Hammer is over on the left. And as long as you have that nice yellow heat, you can continue to work on your weld. But as it gets crusty, it's important to brush it, reflux it, put it right back in the fire so that you can continue to secure that weld. After I've got it to welding temperature at least twice, if I'm feeling good about it, I'll hit on the shearing plane. Sometimes that will show you that it wasn't stuck well enough, but in this case, it was welded just fine. and keeping it to that yellow temperature as you weld it and then start to forge it becomes very important. We've now got our drop tong weld summary again in case anyone wants to take notes, but here's your steps. But the bottom line is you're getting the weld into position before you lose your heat, and the flux and how high your heat is what buys you that time, as well as the practicing the getting them into alignment quickly and dropping the tongs, picking up the hammer, and having everything ready to go.